I'm Ed Brubaker. I'm known for creating a book called Criminal and a lot of other things.
Yeah. You started in indies and you were writing and drawing.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about, why comics and that experience?
I always wanted to do comics. My dad, when I was a little kid, my dad gave me and my brother a huge box of comics that his friends from the office had given him that their kids were through with, basically, like they had older kids. So I think one of my first memories is like reading comics. So I always like wrote and drew comics like my whole life. And it wasn't until I was in my mid-20s that I started writing comics for other people to draw. When I just started reaching my artistic abilities are basically like rudimentary Archie style kind of drawing. So I had ambition to write stories that were beyond that style, basically.
And where were you in your career when other artists started joining your team for the books?
I was in the indie comics days. I was doing stories all the time for like Dark Horse Presents and stuff that I would just write these little short stories or stories for Vertigo, and just get friends to draw them. Or I would have friends ask me to write a story for them because they wanted to draw something. So it was really, I was still drawing my own comics at the same time as doing that for a while, and then I think when I started doing Scene of the Crime, around that time period also, I think I started writing Batman too, and I was just like too busy doing all that stuff really. And then once I hooked up with Sean and we started doing our books, I just felt like no need to try to, bang my head against that wall. Like Sean was, fast and good.
What was it tough getting from the indies into some of these mainstream books? What was the progression like?
No, not really. I mean, it's always like hard to break into any field. I grew up coming to this comic convention and I'd met like editors and stuff when I was just a teenager, and I would print up my own mini comics and give them out to people. So like early on, there were people like Bob Schreck or Shelley Bond who were aware of my stuff and wanted to let me try out for books at like Dark Horse or Vertigo. So it's always a crapshoot. I did a thing at, in Dark Horse Presents with Eric Schanauer, and we just happened to get nominated for some Eisner Awards. And so DC wanted Eric to do some stuff over there, and he said, I'll do a thing at Vertigo if you let my friend Ed write it. And they said, well, can he write? And he said, well, he just got nominated for the best writer in the Eisner Awards, so hopefully. And that was kind of how I started getting paid to do it.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that you had an Eisner, but
just a nomination.
Yeah, so that doesn't count. If it were an Eisner.
I know, it definitely made it, it wasn't hard for DC to hire me when they wanted the artist. But, breaking down those doors, I always tell people the best way to break into comics is to do a comic. Like it's really hard to give a script to an editor and expect that they're going to be able to read it and immediately go, oh, this guy's the shit. You have to, I was lucky in that I drew my own comics, but if I were starting out now and I didn't draw, I would find like a good artist and put aside some money to pay them to draw like a short story. And I always tell people, don't do like your Spider-Man issue or whatever. Just show someone that you can tell a story. Do like a mini comic, and because people just want to see what you can do. Like if you can write a good story, they'll assume you can probably write a good Spider-Man story. They've got people sending them Spider-Man stories all day long, So I think that was what I benefited from, was I just always wanted to write my own things. And so when I got offered a chance to write Batman, I was like, I don't think I could write Batman. And then I had to sit down and think about it and try to analyze what Batman was and why I felt like I couldn't do it. And then I was like, oh, well, if I make it like a noir thing or like mysteries, I think I can probably figure out how to do it. And it's just a guy with like a really fucked up childhood. Like I write that shit all day long. So,
Right from your own experience and
yeah,
your own,
exactly.
Make it your own.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Did you have any kind of education in art or writing?
No, just self-taught. I just grew up doing my own comics and reading a lot of comics and a lot of books. My dad was in naval intelligence, and we moved around a lot, and so I just didn't have a ton of friends and stayed in my room and drew and read a lot of books. So
I was going to ask what comics you read, and I knew that you were watching movies and reading books. And
yeah,
where were your interests? And
I read everything. I read any comic that I could get my hands on growing up. Like my dad would go to the library and bring home those big hardback collections of like old newspaper strips like Prince Valiant or Tarzan, or the Smithsonian book that had like reprints of all sorts of different old newspaper strips. I read Peanuts every day. I read Richie Rich and Little Lulu and Little Dot and all the Archie books. Like I read pretty much any comic, like superhero, whatever. I didn't read a ton of DC actually. I liked Jimmy Olsen comics and Lois Lane comics, and I liked Batman sometimes. I didn't always buy Batman. My brother bought Batman sometimes, and I would read his. But most of the DC comics didn't do a lot for me when I was a kid. I was much more of like a Marvel zombie. But I read everything I could get my hands on. Like I would sneak heavy metals into the house, and I shopped at a store that didn't pay attention when you went back into the adult section, and I looked at underground comics, and so I was kind of anything. I would go from sort of comic discovery to comic discovery. By the time I started publishing my own comics, my favorite comics were stuff like American Splendor and Love and Rockets.
I know a lot of aspiring comics artists. They have their favorite artist, and then they just read that. And I've always felt like, no, you need to read everything if you're going to get your own style.
No, I was very self-educated. I'm actually in my newsletter right now. I've been like sort of writing a little memoir about like the comics that sort of informed my like growth as a person in comics, like just sort of my own personal comics history lesson. Because I do feel like a lot of people, when I talk to them, like the younger generations, I grew up in a time period where there was no internet, so like we had to search things out and look through like the buyer's guide or old fanzines to find out about stuff, and then you'd come to Comic-Con to like search out weird old comics that you'd read about that you'd never seen before. And so I think my generation grew up much more obsessed with kind of cataloging all the different influences or everything that was ever big. Like you don't hear a lot of people talking about like Sugar and Spike anymore, but like in my generation, when I would come to Comic-Con and when I was a teenager and in my early 20s and go to like parties with like the Hernandez brothers or Dan Clowes or any of these guys, we would end up standing around talking about like weird old Jimmy Olsen comics or Sugar and Spike and Herbie, and like there was just a lot of stuff that we all kind of, I think, absorbed and were obsessed with. And like when I was working with Darwin Cook, we would stay up late on the phone just talking about like inkers we liked from the 50s and stuff. So and I would always, he would have his mind blown to know. I'm like, oh, that ink line looks like Lee Elias. And he's like, Lee Elias? How do you know who that guy is? It's like, he inked some issues of The Invaders. But yeah, I was just obsessed with comics, so I kind of took in as much as I could. And, I didn't read comics that I didn't like, but, if I heard that some comic was great, I would seek it out and, find like the ones that really hit for me.
Did you have a day job for a period while you were starting to get into comics, or were you able to make a living pretty quickly?
Oh, no.